to Falmouth. I wrote this lecture for the National Maritime Museum, Cornwall, and I suppose one of the questions they asked me, well, why did you choose these three artists, Kath? Well, for me, they represented a pinnacle in maritime art in Britain in the 19th century. That's when maritime painting was really at its height. And also they all had several things in common. They were all very good yachtsmen. They owned their own boats, and Hemy and Ingram actually went to Australia and back in a sailing boat. So they knew the sea well and all its moods and different styles. But of course, the main common denominator was they all lived in Falmouth. And for those of you who haven't been to Falmouth and don't know what it looks like, I just put this rather lovely aerial photograph of it, what it looks like today. Of course, it's combined with the Carrick Roads, it seemed to be the third naturally deepest harbour in the world. It's probably fourth or fifth now because it's silted up. But it's certainly the deepest in Western Europe. And the other its importance came about, of course, because of the establishment of the Royal Mail Packet in 1688 in Falmouth. And the packet ship's job was to bring the post to and from Britain, and it always came to Falmouth. So Falmouth boomed in that time. And then it had a decline after the packet ships were replaced by steam, of course, at the beginning of the 19th century. But it had this regeneration of success when they built the Falmouth docks. These are the docks here still today. And the railway came, as we said, with Newlyn. The branch line was brought to Falmouth in the 1860s. So it had great communications, and it was also this hub, if you like, for shipping. There are several architectural features that you're going to see in the paintings. You get an aerial view of them here. Pendennis Castle and St Maur's Castle, both built in 1540 by Henry VIII, and the St Anthony's Lighthouse on the end of the Roseland. So these are the two round turreted castles that you'll see in the background of quite a lot of the paintings, one on either headland, on the other side of the harbour, and St Anthony's Lighthouse, which was built in 1835 and is still going today. So we're going to start with the oldest of the three artists, and that's Charles Napier Hemy, who was born in Newcastle in 1841. And he sailed to Australia with his family. He trained and lived briefly as a Roman Catholic priest, as well as working on a sailing ship before he finally decided to be an artist. He studied in Newcastle under a chap called William Bell Scott, who was a marine painter. And this is a typical early Hemy that he did up in the northeast of Tynemouth from 1864. Now, Bell was very much a pre-Raphaelite artist, so hopefully you'll know what that means. But in terms of a technique, it was a very detailed approach to observing nature, and it meant you painted every detail. So it wasn't, and it was all done in the studio. So he came from that sort of background. He had two brothers who were artists, Benedict Hemy and Thomas Hemy. Bernard Benedict was born in Australia when the family had gone out to do gold prospecting. But Charles had returned with his brother and his father to study in Newcastle painting. He married in 1866, and he married a wealthy woman which allowed him to continue his studies in Antwerp under a painter called Baron Leys. And again in 1864, he was travelling as far as Clovelly and painting this incredibly detailed painting. Again, showing off this pre-Raphaelite technique of, can you see he's painted every pebble on the beach, hasn't he? And so this method, of course, is very long and arduous. It takes a long time to create a painting. So his successes were slow to start with. And he, on his return from Antwerp in 1869, he and his wife moved to London. And he was very inspired by and influenced by James McNeill's Whistler's paintings of the Thames. And it started his love of all things maritime, and particularly boats. And he was developing his skills, if you like. But by 1869, he started to travel. He went to Scotland looking for new subjects, but more times than not, he came to Cornwall and Newlyn and St Ives. But this is before our colony of artists came, yeah? Hemy is much older than the Newlyn artists. He's a sort of senior artist. And he came to St Ives in 1869 when he did this painting. And the St Ives colony wasn't going to start until really 1890. So he was already seeking out coastal towns in Cornwall for his inspiration. What brought him back to Falmouth? Well, it's interesting. He first saw Falmouth in 1868 when he was on a ship serving as an apprentice. And when he saw Falmouth, he said it looked as dirty a hole as bad as Shields. That's my best Newcastle accent. Because it wasn't a pretty place then. It was very much a mining town. This is Swampole, and there was a silver mine at Swampole, and this is the chimney to take away the arsenic fumes, which was a byproduct of mining for silver. So there was also a silver mine in Flushing. So Falmouth was sort of surrounded by mines. And what brought him back there in 1881 was, sadly, his first wife died of meningitis. And he was still a Roman Catholic, was a Roman Catholic all his life. And he wrote to fellow Catholics and asked if anybody would take him on. And the daughter of Mr. Freeman, who ran the granite works in Penryn, who's a very wealthy man, had a daughter called Amy, and she said yes. And here she is. And they had 10 children together. No wonder she's sitting down. She looks exhausted, doesn't she? And they had a great life, I think. And his subject matter when he first came to Falmouth, of course, was going to be involving sea and the boats. This is a very early painting of the harbour where the tidal Pool Mill was. This is where the National Maritime Museum Cornwall is at the moment. And it features in quite a lot of paintings of the time. Fishing industry in Falmouth was traditional, like so many of the coastal towns, but Falmouth, of course, because it had all these, the Carrick Roads is a series of flooded riverbeds, had the potential for far more shellfish, and in particular oysters. And oysters were the main kind of harvest crop of the fishing industry in Falmouth. And in fact, if you see the mayoral chain, which I had to see for 8 years, that on the back is a solid gold cast of an oyster shell. And it sums up how important oyster catching was to the town of Falmouth. Now, this is 1878, before he actually moved to Falmouth. He moved to Falmouth in 1881. And it shows you the small boats that, if you've been watching The Fishing Life, they still use today, with the winch on the front to pull the little kind of net baskets up. It's very in his pre-Raphaelite style. It's got dark colours, and can you see all the detail of the moss on the rocks here. So this is opposite Falmouth. This is from Trefusis at Point, looking back at Falmouth. And he would often pick those views. This is a recent acquisition by Falmouth Art Gallery, again of a bigger oyster dredging boat. You can see the nets with the oysters being pulled in. And this is a later painting of 1886. but it has HMS Ganges, which is an ex-Napoleonic Wars battleship, which was converted into a sea cadet training ship. And it was moored for 33 years in Falmouth from 1866 to 1899. And it features in a lot of Hemy's paintings, which we'll see in a minute. So this is looking the other way from Falmouth back to Flushing, showing another aspect of fishing, which is shrimp net fishing. And here's the lad carrying his shrimp net, and the other lad has emptied the catch from the boat on the shore. But can you see his palette is very kind of traditional, sort of greens, browns, and dark blues. One of his first commissions, as well as being a painter, Hemy was a black and white illustrator. He illustrated for quite a few of the magazines of the day, because this was prior to really photography being the main illustration for publications. And it was, he did 24 black and white illustrations for a book called An Unsentimental Journey Through Cornwall. And it was a travelogue written by Mrs. Dina Mullock Creek. And it was first published in 1884. And it tells of her journey with her two nieces around Cornwall. You can get a facsimile copy of it today, which I've got, if you're interested. And this is a seine boat. If you remember from last week, the seine boats were used in groups of 3 to catch the pilchards. But this is one trying to come in a storm. And he used his illustrations for the basis for paintings. And I love the way he calls this one a perilous moment. But then for the oil, he just calls it How the Boat Came In, as if there was nothing to panic about. But you can see how the illustrations then inspired the oil paintings. He was a great observer of all aspects of fishing in Cornwall. And he spent 12 years studying the seine boats and them catching the pilchards. And this is one of my favourites because it just shows you the kind of, because it's got this long, narrow composition. Can you again see the boats being tilted upwards with the weight of the fish that they're dragging out of the nets? No mechanisation here, folks. And this is a watercolour and body colour. And he did lots of studies of the pilchards on the spot. These are all done not from photograph, but from being there. And he had sketchbooks he would take out, and he would sketch the fishermen doing, creating these sort of ideas for paintings. And it all culminated in this huge painting called Pilchards, which he showed at the Royal Academy in 1897, and it was bought for the nation and is now in the Tate Gallery. So this was sort of a culmination of 12 years study, really. And those of you interested, he did it on oil on paper, which he stuck to canvas, which was quite a regular method of Hemy's. I suppose he liked the fluidity of the oil paint on the paper rather than the sort of much kind of tougher surface that canvas is. And it really creates that drama, doesn't it? Although I prefer the vertical version of the subject. And it was bought for the nation for £1,200, which in today's money is about £93,500. And it finally got him noticed. I mean, he was 56 years old by this time, and he was duly elected as an associate of the Royal Academy in 1898. So this was like his calling card. I'm going to talk to you a lot more about the when we do the fame of the Newlyn School of Artists next week, and the significance of having your painting bought by the nation. How did he achieve this feeling of being on the water with the fishermen and observing them from real life? Well, he converted his own seine boat and made it into a floating studio. And this is his first floating studio, called the Van der Veld. And you can just see the original seine boat line here. And then he put a kind of cabin on top. And it was seaworthy. He could sail down to Land's End in it and do paintings on the spot. he had this boat for 6 years. It was very top heavy, and it rolled fearfully, according to his granddaughter, Margaret Powell, despite it having 3 tons of granite ballast in the bottom. This boat was wrecked in 1898, and he hauled it up and put it in his garden. So he had a purpose-built 57 foot yacht built called the Vandermeer. So this was Mark II, and it was it allowed him to sail even further. It was purpose-built oak and mahogany yacht with a cabin just for him and quarters for 2-man crew. We have this photograph of him inside, so you can see, you know, fully carpeted and outlined. It's got his crucifix there, and it had this particularly high roof space, so he could get his 6'2" canvases in. It was actually a 7'6" height cabin space. And the other person who records his life on the Vandermeer is his sister-in-law, Winifred Feynman, who I'll talk to you about in a lot more detail when we do the women artists section. But it's really sums up the luxury of his second floating studio. So initially, when he moved to Falmouth, Hemy lived in One Park Terrace, but he wrote to William Wainwright, if you remember, was another Roman Catholic who was living in Newlyn, and thought, well, actually, what I really want is to have a house near the church. And he bought some land and he built Churchfield. This was, of course, to accommodate his ever-expanding family with his 10 kids. And it's now the Athenaeum Club, and it still stands in Falmouth. And it was next door to the Catholic Church. And again, through his sister-in-law, Winifred, you can see what his studio would have been like inside Churchfield. And this is the Catholic Church through the window here. And these are some of his paintings on his easel. And this is, again, a record of what Churchfield would have been like, his home by a sister-in-law. And this is the drawing room. And again, you've got crucifix on the mantelpiece and one of his marine paintings in a beautiful gilt frame. I just love the light in her paintings. I think she was awfully clever. Going back to the fishing theme, so this is 1886. He was really getting into making Falmouth the focus for his paintings and going out on his floating studio, and again capturing all kinds of different fishing that was going on. This is them catching smelt. Smelt is a small fish which looks a bit like a salmon. And again, you've got HMS Ganges, the Sea Cadet training ship in the background, with St Maur's Castle and St Anthony's Lighthouse in the background. And this is another oil painting that features HMS Ganges. And I think he's still, this is still 1886, he's still painting every wave, isn't he? And it's still got that detail. But slowly he develops a much freer technique because of his observation. And this is a wonderful painting my successor, Brian Stewart, bought for Falmouth Art Gallery with help from the lottery, etc., called A Longshore Fisherman. And they're using a trammel net, which is used to catch flatfish such as John Dory and plaice. And you can just see the flatfish coming up with the net. And he would know the fishermen, Hemy, and he would go along and find out when they were bringing the nets in. And he talked in his diary about getting up at 5:30 to paint this picture. And this is off the Roseland, and you've got St Anthony's Lighthouse in the background. He also tackled this subject of loss at sea. I mean, it's sort of echoes of what Langley was doing with his figures in Newlyn about how treacherous the life of a fisherman was, and how the families were not only grief-stricken but poverty-stricken when that happened. And Hemy did it just with this rather haunting painting of a sunken or a sinking boat in a wild sea. But he also did paint the rescues of some of the shipwrecks with the newly formed Royal National Institute, Lifeboat Institute. And he was asked by the Prince of Wales, no less, to make a print of this painting in order to raise funds for the RNLI. And it's of the Bob Newman lifeboat, which was the lifeboat for Falmouth, and they've just rescued everybody from the wreck in the distance. Again, a black and white work. He also tackled the rather thorny issue of wrecking, and this is called Birds of Prey. And it's not a great photo of it, but you can see the bodies on the rocks and the men coming to salvage what they can from the wreck. He also produced this enormous painting, which is in the Art Gallery, New South Wales, of smugglers trying to escape the customs men to save their necks. I love the fact they've got a cannon on the back of their boat that they're trying to fight back. It's a real swashbuckling picture, isn't it? But again, it shows Hemy's great knowledge and understanding of the sea and of how boats sail. And in his later career, he started to focus more on yacht racing. He put some of these 10 children, the boys, to good use because they loved sailing in the local regattas, and he would get them to sail around his floating studio to paint them. He said he was inspired when he saw them come back from a local regatta to tackle the subject. His children hailed me and came alongside, made fast and boarded me. They were wet through as it had been blowing hard. They were shivering with cold, tired and exhausted. I soon had them in dry clothing and gave them hot soup. Well, I said, you're a lot of young fools. Oh, but it's been such fun, we enjoyed ourselves. To which I replied, youth, but what it is to be young. And some days I got them to sail past my cabin windows again and again, whilst I made studies of the sea. So this is how he operated from about 1900 onwards, and his peak period of yachting paintings was up until the First World War. And of course, he also, and this is another great study for a painting that's in Falmouth's collection. It's actually tempera on paper with gouache, and that was the way he worked when he was working out a painting. He was great friends with John Singer Sargent, the American painter, and he came down to Falmouth in 1905 to do this portrait of Hemy, which again Brian managed to purchase for the art gallery. And of course, Sargent is famous for being described as an American born in Italy, educated in France, who looks like a German, speaks like an Englishman and paints like a Spaniard. And Hemy is 64 years old in this painting. And he described in a letter that Sargent spent 3 days painting this picture, chain smoking throughout and swearing in several different languages. So his final works, also done during the First World War, obviously was hampered a bit by not being able to paint necessarily outdoors. And he did many gouaches that are very sort of heartfelt, and again echo what the Newlyners were doing about what happens when the sailors and the fishermen go away and leave their loved ones, and the girl is waving to them as they leave. And when Hemy died in September 1917, a memorial exhibition was held at the Fine Arts Society in London, just called The Life of the Sea. And they hailed Hemy as a painter of man's relationship with the waters. His knowledge of the sea was superb. As a draftsman of waveforms, he stands alone. And this is a rather lovely one of porpoises chasing mackerel from 1912. Moving on to Henry Scott Tuke, who knew Hemy and was very inspired by him being the older artist. So some of you know all this, but to repeat, he was born in York to a Quaker family, and his father came down to Falmouth when he was just 2 years old and set up a practice in Wood Lane. So Tuke grew up in Falmouth. He then went away to school, went to the Slade in Italy and France, and as we saw last week, came to Newlyn. He was a very precocious little boy. He learnt to swim in Falmouth, and his first painting of a tall ship, or drawing of a tall ship, was done when he was just 10 years old. So this is roughly 1868. It's not bad, is it, for a 10-year-old? We saw last week that he came because his brother died of TB when he was just 27 years old, and Tuke was a bit of a loss, really, as what to do. But because of his friends Gotch and Walter Langley being in Newlyn, he decided to come and join them there as well. And we saw the work he did in Philip Harvey's fish cellar. But he decided in 1885, after he'd been on a sailing trip the previous July with his friend William Ayerst Ingram, on the way to Foy, he'd passed Falmouth, and it reminded him maybe of his youth. That's my theory. And one of the reasons, anyway, why he decided to move to Falmouth, and he stayed there for the rest of his life. And if you remember that photo I showed you earlier, that was of Swanpool with the chimney there, which has been demolished. But this is the remains of the count house for the silver mine, and Tuke rented this cottage with other people from the Fox family, who were also Quakers, who owned the mine. And this is his first lean-to studio. So it gave him access to the sea. There's a set of steps that came down to the beach. He could row out to see what ships were coming in. And of course, he could row around the corner to paint his bathing boys and nudes, which he was so famous for. But the first painting he did when he came to Falmouth was of a London model, a Cockney lad, and he had to pay him to come down to Cornwall to pose for him, and his name was Walter Shilling. So it's actually a Cockney barrow boy painted twice, not two Falmouth fishermen. But it sums up what Tuke was going to paint for the rest of his life, which is this view across the mouth of the Fowl estuary. You've got St Anthony's on the end of the Roseland, the tall ships, the windjammers coming from the other side of the world with their cargo. He did as many paintings of boats as he did of bathing boys. And like Stanhope Forbes and all the other Newlyners, portraiture was his other form of income. So here's Walter posing for a painting owned by Sir Elton John. He owns over 50 paintings by Tuke. And it's sort of the beginning of Tuke experimenting more with his plein air painting. But he loved painting outdoors, and he loved painting on boats. And he had many boats. And this is a local lad that became a frequent model called Our Jack. And Jack Rolling was what was called a key scamp. He worked at Falmouth docks and was to be found sort of on the quays of Falmouth. And this is still very much in a Newlyn style. Although he'd moved to Falmouth, his work would be categorised as a Newlyn style of painting and a Newlyn artist. And it's using those dark blue and dark brown tones, isn't it? So we're still painting on the grey day to heighten the realism in the painting. Tuke's sister described Jack Rolling as a lovable young barbarian who could look like an angel and act like a demon. And he looks like it in this painting, doesn't he? And Tuke decided to follow suit with Hemy, kind of one-upping him really. And he bought this old French brigantine for £41 in around 1886. Now, it was full of holes. He had to plug the holes with, here he is standing on the mast there. And this is it moored at the Barpool Mill. This is that mill that you saw in the Hemy painting. And he also cut a skylight in the deck and cut a hole in the side of the boat so you could see out. He could see out at water level. Never went anywhere. It was moored at Green Bank, just opposite the hotel there, for the time that he had it. But he used it as a set to place his models. So this is Jack Rolling again in the sort of bows of the ship. He painted the bulwarks green, and you can see the light coming from the skylight that he created to cast the shadows across the figure. This is another one of Jack and his fishermen in the bows of the boat. But again, can you see how the light's coming from above, hitting Jack's face, and he and his doggy are listening with intent to the sailor telling a yarn. His most famous painting he did on board the Julie is this one, All Hands to the Pumps. And no, I don't think he painted it in a storm. It wasn't that plein air, but certainly it was a memory of a storm. And it's a huge painting, and it took him nearly a year to paint. And here we've got Jack again and his fellow fishermen who would appear in a lot of the other paintings. And this, when it was shown at the Royal Academy in London, was seen as a great success. It was sold for £420, roughly £34,500 in today's money. And it was on the walls at the same time as Stanhope Forbes's Health of the Bride and Frank Bramley's Save. So he was regarded as one of the big guns of the Newlyn School, if you like, and we'll look at how that catapulted him into the sort of fame with the other Newlyn artists. Another painting painted on the Julie is this one called Euchre or Dog Watch, and here he's deliberately painted the bulwark screen because he loved putting his models in red shirts, loved that red-green combination, just like Mr. Constable did in his landscape paintings. And it's still very much in the Newlyn style. You've got that grey day, of which we have so many here in Cornwall. And we've got all the local fishermen and Jack again with his knife in his waist there. And Tom Tregenza and Sam Hingston, who's here. And it's the only Newlyn School painting I know with a monkey in it. When Stanhope Forbes visited Tuke, because he lived on the Julie for a while, as well as having rooms in Pennants Point, he describes the visit as Tuke showed us his pictures. They are simply beautiful. Gave us a wonderful tea under stranger circumstances than I have ever took a meal. So Stanhope Forbes was a bit fussy, I think, about where he had his tea. This painting won a gold medal when it was shown in Munich, and the Bavarian government bought it at the time. So this is the second studio. This is Pennants Point again, and this is a purpose-built studio that Tuke had built in around 1898, and it showed off how successful he was becoming. Another important painting of that time is The Fisherman, which features Tom Tregenza doing a bit of line fishing, or whiffling as it's called in Falmouth, and you can just see the line coming off the back of the boat there. And it sums up all the different kinds of vessels that used to come into Falmouth harbour. Because of this deep natural gully in the harbour, the big boats still can come in and more, and then they famously waited for orders as to where their cargo was going to go. Falmouth for orders, as it was called. And you have steam launches, you have the barks, and you have longboats being rowed either for pleasure or bringing chandlers back and forth to the ships. And this was shown in the big exhibition at Nottingham Castle Museum and was purchased at the time. Tuke loved sailing. It was really in his blood. Unlike Hemy, who painted sailing, Tuke was too busy sailing himself. Very few paintings by Tuke of actual sailing. This is one I love called The Steering Lesson. One of the local fishermen, Neddy Hall, with his youngest son, Freddie, teaching him how to steer. And it's the angle of the boat and the sort of choppiness of the water that really gives you a sense you're on floating, doesn't it? And then big change in Tuke's work, a bit like his friend Gotch, who'd gone to Italy in 1892 to 3, and Tuke joined him there in Florence, but he then went to Rome. And unlike Gotch, who was influenced by painting and of the Italian Renaissance, Tuke was influenced by sculpture and looked at Michelangelo's David. If you know that sculpture, you'll know it's a contrapposto pose where the weight is on the opposite side on one leg, and then there's a twist to the body. This painting had 10 models. It was painted on the water. I always say to people, you imagine doing life drawing where there is the tides going in and out, your models are changing colour, going from pink to blue. He would bring on fresh models when all his models have gone blue, and the light is shifting. So this is a big change in Tuke embracing Impressionism. We talked a bit about that in the first session, and how some of the artists who had been these very traditional sort of realist, Bastien Lepage influenced artists actually moved with the times. And this was the second painting bought for the nation by Tuke. And it almost is by a different artist from the other one. Tuke loved sailing, as I said. He even wrote articles about Falmouth. This is an article called A Day in Falmouth Harbour, and he illustrated it with his own drawings and paintings of tall ships in Falmouth. By the way, this painting was sold for £525, which is roughly £43,000 in today's money. So he was as successful with his paintings as Stanhope Forbes were in terms of their financial value. And I can read a bit from the article that he wrote about A Day in Falmouth Harbour. I love giving you the quote while you look at this picture. He says, "The wind is light from the west-southwest as we slip from the moorings and glide out from the inner harbour. This ought to be a good day to see the finest sight our port can offer, the arrival of a homeward bounder, all travel-stained and weather-beaten, now first sighting land over a voyage of perhaps 3 or 4 months. This seems to be the case for a vessel that's just brought up in the roads, with a swarm of small steamers and boats buzzing around her. As we clear the castle head and get out into the open, the wind freshens and the Londoner recognises that this is no pleasure trip on the Welsh Harp or Serpentine, but real sea sailing." And he's having a little dig at his London friends. So another thing I like to point out, that most of Tuke's paintings, of course, done on the spot, are of the sailing boats at anchor or just moving off, because of course he didn't use photography. So this is a rare painting of a bark in full sail. So this picture would have been done in the time it took for it to pass him. So what, 30, 40 minutes tops? He loved going on sailing trips whenever he could get a chance to go on a tall ship. He knew a lot of the captains who came into Falmouth, and because he would want to use their sailors to pose for him if possible. And then of course we have this was a trip he did to Liverpool on the ship the Roman Empire. The journey took him 4 days, and he describes setting off from Falmouth. "A strange sensation sailing out of this bay. Mrs. Fouracre, who was his housekeeper, distinctly visible on my porch. It soon began to rain, and with a headwind and sea, we had rather a bad start. In the morning, I was a bit upset, and it took me most of Friday to get to rights. Saturday was lovely, and I got a good bit of painting done. The Cornish coast was still in sight most of the day." So he loved going on these sailing trips. He managed to go on the Ganges when it left Falmouth in 1899, when it headed for Shotley and Plymouth. And then one of his favourite sailing trips was on the Grace Harbour, which was, he was invited by Captain James to sail from Falmouth to Nordenham in Germany, which took 5 days. And he did one of my favourite watercolours called A Fair Wind on board the Grace Harbour, which shows his tremendous skill at watercolour. When I ran Falmouth Art Gallery, boat builders used to come in and admire Tuke's work because they said he always got his rigging right. And he was very clever with the rigging because he didn't paint every rope. He used a dry brush across. Can you see how it sort of falters slightly? So it gives the impression of more ropes being there than are in real life. So his watercolours developed this impressionist style enormously. But he also painted every boat that was in Falmouth Harbour, and he was always interested in different boats. So this is the missionary boat. This is actually the missionary boat here, this little yawl here. And on board is Captain James Badger from the British Sailors Society, who would give a service on a boat for other crews, and they would raise a flag, and the other boat crews would join them. He also painted the Implacable, another ex sort of naval ship that was kept in Falmouth and used as a training ship for sea cadets. And this one was in Falmouth for several years in the 1920s. It was restored by his friend, Tuke's friend, Wheatley Cobb. And when Cobb died, it was towed to Portsmouth in 1932. Tuke also used to go out and in his rowing boat along to the docks and paint the boats that had moored there. This is a Lowestoft trawler, and you can just imagine him sitting on his rowing boat with his watercolours by his side, painting this on the spot. And it's full of colour, isn't it? And it's also unusual because it's got an example of a steam crane, which were used on the docks as well. And this is a very impressionistic watercolour called Key Scamps. If you ever watch, not Flog It, what's the other? Yeah, Flog It. Paul Martin, who comes from Cornwall, did a piece on Tuke, which I helped write. And Andrew Tozer, who's an impressionist contemporary artist, picked this as his favourite Tuke painting. And it sums up the kind of freedom of life for kids in Falmouth at the time. Tuke also had a studio in the town, this building here, which isn't there anymore, which was a store. And it also, on rainy days, allowed him to paint what he saw both in the little harbour there and out to sea. We've already seen some of his watercolours. He became a member of the, well, it was the Old Society of Painters in Watercolour in 1904. And he became a full member in 1911. And he was very successful with his watercolours, sold several hundred of them. And again, he was very clever at capturing that light on the water in Falmouth. And that became his forte, really, for me. I think his watercolours are stunning, and I think they show this immediacy and his most impressionist technique, if you like. All done on boats in the harbour on the spot. So this is Falmouth from Flushing. This one's called Twilight, with this sort of mackerel sky. If you're into watercolour, it's using a wet on wet technique, so it sort of blurs slightly. And this is another one of ships in Falmouth Harbour. Like I say, he was a great yachtsman, was Tuke. If anything, he lived a frugal life. He rented his cottage. He didn't have running water and electricity until the 1920s. But the one thing he spent his money on was racing yachts. And he started with fairly small boats. This is the Firefly, which he used to sail. And it's what's called a half-rater. I'm afraid I'm not a yachtsman, but half-raters used to have to compete with bigger boats. And he and his friends got a bit annoyed by this, by the Royal Yacht Club, because they thought it was unfair. So they set up their own Falmouth Sailing Club in 1894, and Tuke became Vice Commodore of it in 1898. And they were so successful in the end, the Corinthian class that the races had established were brought back into the fold of the Royal Yacht Club. A rare painting of people sailing. This is called The Run Home. And again, using the Red Heart as his sort of floating studio. And he was always purchasing and having boats made. They were made in Falmouth, And this is one of his gaff rig boats called Flamingo, which cost him around 11,000. It cost him £150 in the late 19th century, which is roughly £11,500 in today's money. So he loved sailing. His diaries are full of how many cups he won and regattas. It's amazing he ever had any time to do any painting. And this is a rare picture of a later, he owned a Sunbeam in later life, and this is a rare picture of them racing Sunbeams in Falmouth Harbour in 1927. But it was really the capturing of like the last days of sail, where just before steam took over and engines were put in boats, that Tuke is really, I think, goes down in history as recording this period in these wonderful watercolours, of which he produced hundreds. And he captured that unusual light that Falmouth has, which is different from Newlyn, which is different from St Ives, mainly because, of course, all these flooded river valleys are reflecting the water. And if you live in Falmouth, you'll often look across at the Roseland and it'll be shrouded in mist, but you'll have this sort of blowhole of light over Falmouth. So he's got the light on the water and the dark clouds behind. He was a great observer of light and the changing effect light had on colour and his subject. So this is a four-masted bark, and it's more or less a white-hulled boat on a white sea with white sails against a white sky, isn't it? And the only thing defining it is the wash that he's used mixed with blue and brown. And can you just see the sailors balancing on the crossbars to lower or bring up the sails? And then here's exactly the same subject, but on a different kind of day. So he loved rusty bottom boats, the ones that had metal boats that had rusted, because it brought another colour in. And he often had a figure in a small boat in the foreground. During the First World War, he couldn't paint outside unless you had a permit. And of course, by this time, he'd lost the Julie, he'd sold her, and was always looking for other boats to paint on. And he happened to know the harbour master, and they captured 2 German boats at the beginning of the First World War and had them moored at Trelisic. And one of them was called the Penape. So he said, could I pose my models on it? And he duly did, with their tam o' shanters, pretending to stow the head sails, and in this occasion getting the canvas on the boat. He also was famous for capturing a lot of the famous ships that came to Falmouth. This is the Lady of Avenel, if you're into your history of ships. And this was bought by Captain Wilfred Dowman. And it was a brig that he had brought into Falmouth in 1919. And she was fitted out after having a fire in her hold. And of course, Dowman also bought the Cutty Sark and had that restored, and it was moored in Falmouth in the 1920s. Tuke did several paintings of her. And of course, the ship Discovery, which is now in Dundee, which was one of Captain Scott's Antarctic ships, and was later used as a sort of marine science ship. And this is the Fable, which was another one of the late steel-hulled 3-masted finished bark that set a record coming from Falmouth to from Adelaide in 125 days. And one of his final paintings, which was exhibited at the Royal Academy, a watercolour, was just of a local lad stringing pullock. So fishing was part of the life of all the artists, and even the ones living in Falmouth. And it was something that occupied Tuke and Hemy's paintings. Now, I haven't got long to talk about William Ayerst Ingram, who's the third artist in this story. But there isn't so much known about him. And also you can see he died quite young in 1913. This is him with Tuke, that they were great friends. If you remember, Tuke came to Falmouth, or saw Falmouth again, on Ingram's boat, the Verbena, when they sailed it to Foy in 1884. And Ingram did a whole exhibition of that trip at Dowders Wells in London in 1885. But it was after meeting, and he started out in Newlyn, where he met Walter Langley. He also painted in St Ives, and these are quite his early sort of tentative watercolours. I rather like this one of Penzance Harbour from the water. So he was good at watercolour, but he was also brilliant at oil painting. And it was after he met Gotch, who had just come back from Australia, that Ingram decided to go to Australia as well. And I always imagine this is probably what the kind of weather they hit when you was steaming across the sea to go to Australia, which of course took several months. And although the Melbourne Argus, when he arrived, said his visit was for his health, he'd actually take 80 watercolours to be selected for the Anglo Artists Art Exhibition. And it helped found the Royal Anglo-Australian Society of Artists. And Ingram was a big part of this. And his forte was organising artists and promoting their work. And that's why there is so much work by Newlyn and Cornish artists in Australia. And this is a painting by Ingram of Exmouth that's in the Art Gallery, New South Wales. So he was painting oils on the Thames in London, and he became a member of the Oil Painters Society. But he moved to Falmouth in 1890, and after he came back from Australia, lived in Woodhouse Terrace until 1895. And he had 35 paintings in an exhibition there that was reviewed favourably. The packet reported that Mr. Ayerst Ingram has recently taken up residence in Falmouth and was erecting a studio in the picturesque corner of the docks area. In 1894, along with his friend Tuke and John Eva Downing, he established the first Falmouth Art Gallery. This is a year before Newlyn Art Gallery, which we're going to look at the end of our course. And so he was applying these skills of bringing artists together. Tuke wasn't that bothered with it. He actually had his own studio that he sold directly from, but the Newlyn artists would show their work and they would have social evenings. It's in a building that doesn't exist anymore, but it was in Grove Place, for those of you who know Falmouth. And as to his own work, I mean, it very similar but different to Tuke in that it was all about the sea and the sky and the boats, but he kind of let the sky and the sea dominate, and he wasn't a figure painter. So unlike Hemy and Tuke, who's the figures kind of are much more to the forefront in their paintings, for Ingram it was all about the sea. And again, because he was a yachtsman himself, he really understood the sea. And I love the different temperatures of the colours that he uses to paint it and the light on the water. And yeah, he didn't have the same fame as Tuke, but I think on certain days he was just as good as Tuke. And sometimes his work is mistaken for Tuke because it has this very light impressionist touch. I love the birds flying off in the foreground here. And he's got that sort of grey light, but here he's emphasised the greenness of the sea, which again, if you live on by the sea or you sail a lot, you see all those changes. And if you live in Falmouth, you know this one quite well. It's a tiny little picture of the beach bathing huts on Gillingvays Beach, because by this time, by the turn of the century, Falmouth was becoming very much a tourist destination, if you like. But he used that, he was like Langley, very interested in Japanese prints, very clever at kind of making minimal figures, and then all about being the huge sort of expanse of sky, low horizons, and making it an interesting composition. This is one of my favourites of a sailing ship under the full moon, and it's almost done in a pointillist style, isn't it? Ingram went to America in 1896 and married May Martha Fay in Falmouth, Massachusetts. They came back to Falmouth and lived in Melville Road before moving to Wood Lane. And they had one son, Martin, who was born in 1903. Between 1902 and 4, Ingram was the vice president of the Royal Cornwall Polytechnic Society, which Tuke was vice president of as well, which was, before they built the gallery, was very much the place to exhibit your work in Falmouth. And these are just some of the many oil paintings that Ingram did, that are very kind of fresh, have a liveliness to them. I'm not a sailor, but I feel they sum up that feeling of expanse of the sea and what it must be like to be on a boat with nobody else in sight, and that sense that you could go on forever. And this was bought by the London Borough, and they bought the City Council of London, and it's in the Guildhall Art Gallery. If you've never been there, they have fantastic collection of art, and particularly 19th century and early 20th century art. And this is another one I really like, of him capturing that sort of sunset or dawn on the sea, and really starting to play with the impressionist colours of the reflections in the water. He also started to paint in this much more sort of thick impasto sort of way as well. And there's two big paintings owned by Falmouth Art Gallery, usually hanging in the stairwell. And this is one of them, Schooner on the High Seas. And the other is this one of the Home Port, which isn't of the Ganges. I did find which boat it was, but it's a very thickly painted work, and it's got a red sea with a red sunset. So he died sadly in March 1913 at the age of just 58, and he's buried alongside his friends. Tuke and Ingram's graves are right next to each other. Tuke, although he was brought up a Quaker, is not in the Quaker graveyard in York because he rejected all that. And Hemy, of course, is buried with his mother in the Catholic side of the Falmouth churchyard as well. So I feel they're three incredibly important marine painters of British art in the 19th and early 20th century. And they all had a key connection with the Newlyn School of Artists. And certainly Tuke was regarded as a Newlyn School artist, even though he lived in Falmouth from 1885 until he died in 1929. So I hope you've enjoyed that. It's a